It's October, the best month of the year. That means you're probably about to hear the Monster Mash at every single Halloween-related event you go to. At Halloween parties, when you're waiting in line for apple cider at the corn maze, and while buying a 30-foot tall skeleton at Home Depot. I'm sure you're familiar with the Monster Mash, and probably even a little sick of it, because it is the preeminent novelty song for autumn. But there's a whole world of Halloween novelty songs that are almost completely forgotten, and it's difficult to figure out why. Many of them are funnier, catchier, and, I mean this in the best possible way, stupider than old Boris Pickett working in the lab late one night. I'm Dan.
Hi, I'm Jake. Let's explore some novelty Halloween songs that deserve to make your spooky playlist this year, and we'll see if we can reanimate some life into them. Novelty songs have been around for about as long as recorded music. People have argued over the years that throughout the first half of the 20th century, record companies were less looking for musical talent and more interested in cheap gimmicks and catchy nonsense, which sort of makes a lot of sense because there was plenty of nonsense. There's some weird early examples that are kind of hard to figure out the appeal of 100 years later. Like there's Katie, which was billed as the sensational new stammering song, but just reading the title looks less like a stammer. It makes it more look like somebody might be singing an ode to their white supremacist girlfriend. And then there's stuff like, Yes, We Have No Bananas, which just speaks for itself.
Yes, we have no bananas.
And who could forget the Stone Cold Banger, which might be the best song title parenthetical we've ever seen. Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight?
Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight?
One of the earliest Halloween-related novelty songs we could find was the 1956 song The Flying Saucer by Dickie Goodman. It's not explicitly for Halloween, but it's got a sci-fi horror bent that's reminiscent of that old, mostly not true story about Orson Welles scaring everyone by reading War of the Worlds on the radio. It actually isn't an original composition. Rather, it's a series of samples of popular songs telling the story of a UFO invasion. And you know what? It's actually really cool.
Pardon me, madam. Would you tell our audience what would you do if the saucer were to land? Duck back in the air! Thank you. And now the thin gentleman there.
What I'm gonna do?
All the samples were unauthorized, so Goodman did get sued. In that way, it's kind of like Paul's Boutique 30 years before hip-hop sampling. And I love that the album literally says crazy novelty on it. Subtlety was not a strength of these record companies. 2 years later, we got one of the early Alvin and the Chipmunks tunes that you could throw in the Halloween novelty category if you wanted to, called Witch Doctor.
And then the witch doctor, he told me what to do. He said that...
And honestly, it's a little more Love Potion number 9 than Scooby-Doo, so we're not going to include it in this list. Also, Christmas time has just made us eternally sick of the Chipmunks.
The late 50s, specifically 1958, is where our craze begins. And it starts with monsters. The ones in Universal Pictures that had begun releasing in 1925, so we have to backtrack a bit. The Universal monsters, Phantom of the Opera, The Mummy, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster and his bride, and the Wolfman had been re-released in theaters on and off for 25 years at this point. After that first wave of monster films in the 1930s, the monster movies got increasingly silly. Movies with genuine themes, pathos, and scares like Bride of Frankenstein gave way to schlocky team-up movies like Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and outright comedies like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Only occasionally did we see another actual horror hit, like Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954. And most of the time, Universal was making the choice to have Bela Lugosi play the Hunchback rather than Dracula, and some other baffling decisions. I don't mean to say it's all bad. In fact, it's not. Tons of it is a retro good time, but it wasn't scary. Monsters weren't scary anymore. They were fun. Enter the novelty songs.
It's difficult to pin down what song actually started the late 50s boom in Halloween songs. I know I Put a Spell on You by Screamin' Jay Hawkins always makes everyone's Halloween playlist every year.
I put a spell on you.
And it came out in 1956, so if you really wanted to, you could say that might be ground zero for our novelty song craze, but I don't really think that one counts as a novelty tune. I mean, sure, it's spooky, but that goes for just about everything Screamin' Jay Hawkins ever did, and to label I Put a Spell on You as a novelty song kind of sounds like you'd have to label everything the Misfits ever put out as a novelty song too, so we don't really buy that one. Really, we have to move about 2 years further for the absolute explosion to happen.
Online, the most specific any website gets about release dates is the year, so we can't exactly pin down if any songs came out a few months earlier and perhaps inspired others. After I Put a Spell on You in 1956, we found literally nothing Halloween related that came out in 1957. And then in 1958, you get, ready for it? Screamin' Ball at Dracula Hall by the DuPonts, Haunted House by Johnny Fuller, Vampira by Bobby Bear, The Blob by the Five Blobs, She's My Witch by Kip Tyler, Dinner with Drac by John Zacherle, Frankenstein's Party by the Swingin' Phillies, Frankenstein's Den by the Hollywood Flames, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by the Monotones, and Morgus the Magnificent by Morgus and the Ghouls. Dozens more followed in 1959, and at this point, it's kind of feeling like Monster Mash was actually kind of late to the party.
In 1958, it's still prior to the British invasion, which helps give all these songs a certain sound that is just perfectly crystallized to one time period. Elvis made everyone realize they could make $1 billion, and everyone raced to put together copycat acts and songs. Everyone's trying for the same sound and themes, essentially. This first wave of novelty songs is rock and roll for sure, but it's a part of that brief stretch right before rock music ditched the saxophone as a core instrument. It's more like Fats Domino rock and roll. No edge, all fun. Most of these tunes are also indebted to surf music and doo-wop in a way that wouldn't have happened if this craze had started 5 or 6 years later. They go perfectly with movies that are either black and white or eye-bleedingly technicolor. None of it's too serious or too scary, and they're fun whether you're trick-or-treating as a kid or taking your significant other to the haunted house. The best ones tell a story, and almost always have some kind of sound effects like werewolf growls or laboratory instruments, though I could do without all the dime store Bela Lugosi impressions. And oof, did we mention how cool the covers are.
In 1959, there were almost as many novelty tunes as 1958, but I gotta say, a lot of these are noticeably worse than 58's. I don't know why, but 1958 just got it right. There were a bunch of Halloween tunes released every year for a while, and 1962 is another banner year, with stuff like Beware by Bill Buchanan.
Your boyfriend might be a teenage ghoul.
And of course, Monster Mash.
To my surprise, he did the monster mash.
But we'll get back to that in a second. 1963 is when the trend starts to taper off, and then the novelty song craze is just about done by the mid-1960s. Though there were 2 or 3 really good ones in 1965, like I'm the Wolfman by Round Robin.
I'm the Wolfman. I'm the Wolfman, baby.
1965 is just about the last year for novelty Halloween boom. And it's fun to speculate as to what put it in its grave. People might have grown tired of the formula, a lot of the songs have a similar sound, and most of them are just about partying with monsters, so I can see it wearing thin by 1965. And tons of them have that one riff in them.
Perhaps it was that the fun versions of Universal monsters had been somewhat replaced by the technicolor, blood-spouting, very British Gothic monsters, such as Christopher Lee's Dracula or Peter Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein. Maybe, but those movies started coming out in 1958, so it's a little early. Could it be that actually horrific horror movies like Night of the Living Dead had put the fear of monsters back into people? Totally could be. Maybe rock and roll had just moved on to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, so surfy doo-wop monster songs that were, forgive the pun, toothless, just became phenomenally uncool.
We would be remiss to say that Halloween songs completely died out with early rock and roll in the mid-60s, however. Some people have really carried on the legacy of artists like John Zacherle. Radio DJ Dr. Demento made a career out of horror-themed parody tunes and, discovered Weird Al in the process. There's Dr. Reanimator putting out music like Move Your Dead Bones, but honestly, is this supposed to be a novelty song or is it just tremendously bad? We can't really tell. Maybe a bunch of Edgar Winter's weird stuff? Does Thriller count as one too? Honestly, I don't know. Sure, I guess you could throw it in if you want to, but with bands, spooky, fun songs about vintage horror continued, just in a different format. There's some groups like Alice Cooper, Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson that made horror part of the whole deal, but we feel like most of their stuff is way too serious to count with this trend. It's all way more the Devil's Rejects than the Munsters. We would argue that it was punk musicians who carried the torch.
And we feel very at home here. When Jake and I were about 10 years old, we saw a bunch of Universal horror films by checking them out at the library near our grandparents' farm, and we spent a rainy weekend watching them. It was hugely influential on me. I loved them all, even the really stupid ones. After that, horror was my favorite thing in the world. Then, when I was in the 8th grade, my friend Adam, who's contributed music to this show before, lent me a Misfits CD. My mind was absolutely blown. Here I am, this nerdy little kid, discovering that there's a really cool band singing about all manner of horror stuff that I was fascinated with. They became my first favorite band, and horror and punk music have been intertwined for us ever since. I mean, hell, Jake and I have written some goofy horror-themed songs in punk bands that we've been in.
When you learn some history of punk music, this makes a ton of sense. Halloween and punk just go so well together. Most punk is indebted to the same surf, doo-wop, and 1950s rock that our peak Halloween novelty songs are, at least in its deepest roots. Glenn Danzig was a massive fan of horror movies, and wrote his own song called Vampira about the vampiric leading lady from Plan 9 from Outer Space. The Damned must have been fans too, because they wrote a song about watching the same movie late at night with Plan 9 Channel 7. The Dead Kennedys penned their own Halloween tune. And the Cramps added their own weird psychobilly energy to a classic formula with stuff like Creature from the Black Leather Lagoon. I mean, 1950s inflected horror stuff was almost the Cramps' whole thing. Not every horror punk song fits into this mold. Some of it takes itself too seriously or is just too genuinely tasteless to count, but there is definitely a chunk of songs that fit nicely next to the late 1950s, early 60s novelty stuff. I mean, come on, the Misfits even eventually covered the Monster Mash. There are tons of examples of punks who are clearly inspired by acts like the Crypt-Kickers. Speaking of which, let's roll back to 1962 and spend some more time with some of them.
Okay, honestly, when we set out to do this video, we were planning on totally avoiding the Monster Mash. Everybody knows it, and everybody's heard it 9 million times, but its story was actually really good. It was too good for us to gloss over. In the early 60s, Bobby Pickett, the singer for the band The Cordials, had apparently been doing a Boris Karloff impression during live sets, which everybody loved. A bandmate named Lenny Capizzi was aware of how well Novelty records sold, and encouraged him to write a song that he could use his Karloff voice in. So the two wrote Monster Mash and set it to wax in May of 1962. The whole thing was a commercial gimmick right from the start, with Pickett's idea being that the song could just be monsters doing the latest dance. He originally thought it should be the twist, but Capizzi turned him on to a new dance called the mashed potato.
Hey everyone, this is Cool Cats RS, showing all you cool cats out there how to do the mashed potato dance.
For me, I've always thought of the mashed potato as this one dance that this kid in Peanuts does. The The Monster Mash's accompanying dance is basically an update of the mashed potato, with just Frankenstein monster-esque stiff arm movements included, kind of like Thriller. Honestly, this guy's doing like a Frankenstein monster running man, so the Peanuts really seem to be onto something. Pickett and Capizzi presented a piano and vocals demo to an LA-based engineer named Gary Paxton, and Paxton instantly recognized it was a hit. Paxton recorded all of it at his own studio, including doing the sound effects himself, and released it on his own label. He drove around California to radio stations, handing out copies to DJs.
Interestingly, Mel Taylor, the drummer for the all-time great surf rock band The Ventures, is generally credited with having drummed on the song, but it looks like some people actually dispute this. The song was released in late August 1962 and topped the Billboard Hot 100 the week before Halloween. It was banned by BBC Radio for being too morbid, which is absolutely hilarious to hear a song that is all spoopy, no scary, goofier than it is ghoulish, and just completely appropriate for 5-year-olds. Bobby Pickett's tune has been a perennial Halloween favorite ever since, but he's actually not the only person to have a hit with a Monster Mash. The same year that Monster Mash came out, it was covered and released on an LP by John Zacherle, who had been releasing Halloween-related material since 1958, and we mentioned up in part 1.
What a surprise. He did the mash. He did the monster mash.
In fact, Cool Ghoul Zacherle was a sort of Halloween Renaissance man. He was a spooky singer, songwriter, and a television horror host, like Vampira, the Crypt Keeper, Elvira, and Joe Bob Briggs.
Zacherle released a whole album of Halloween tunes under the title Monster Mash Scary Tales, assumingly hoping to cash in on the success of the song. But you know who else wanted to cash in on the success of Monster Mash? Bobby Pickett. He wrote 2 more songs, both monster-themed. One was called Monster's Holiday, and the other was Monster Motion, which he would also release as a single. Both of these songs are terrible, but Monster Motion is a lot better than the Halloween Christmas mashup of Monster's Holiday.
But they were up to no good.
Pickett wanted to put together a full record and accuses Lenny Capizzi and Gary Paxton of slowing down the process by not being, quote, terribly professional individuals. However, once Zacherle's version had sold 40,000 copies and Monster Mash hit number 1 on the Billboard, they were convinced to get working. Pickett and Capizzi wrote about 10 more tracks to fill out the rest of an LP in just 2 or 3 days and recorded the whole thing, and the group was able to put out their own Monster Mash LP just weeks after Zacherle's hit the stores. Snubbed by Zacherle stealing the Monster Mash title, they called theirs the original Monster Mash.
Though Zacherle did put out his Monster Mash LP first, Pickett went out on the road as Bobby Boris Pickett and the Crypt-Kickers, appeared on American Bandstand twice, and eventually, the world pretty much forgot about Zacherle's version. The musical landscape was so wildly different back then that Pickett basically toured by himself, and his band each night would be the venue's house band in whatever city he would happen to be in. Apparently, he would get to a new town, teach the house band all the songs and the chord changes, and then they'd do about a 15-minute set each night. Unlike today, the money was in record sales rather than touring, so Pickett didn't have to tour extensively. His recorded version of Monster Mash continued to sell every year, especially after a 1973 reissue. It's kind of funny to listen to Zacherle's version today because it's so similar in most ways, but the way he sings each line is just a little bit off from the original and sounds more like an alternate take in the studio than its own cover version.
It's also sometimes really dumb. I mean, I'm nitpicking here, but have you ever listened to some of the lines?
The guests included Wolfman, Dracula, and his son.
He could have done better. The song makes some odd choices, too. Pickett's doing a Boris Karloff impression as a mad scientist, but Karloff played the monster. He only played the doctor once in the delightfully meta Frankenstein 1970 that nobody really remembers. Actor Peter Lorre does an Igor bit, but that's not a role he was ever known for playing. It's kind of weird. Honestly, that's sort of a testament to the catchy power of the song, and that it became a hit. It's fun. But there's a lot more to the world of Halloween novelty songs than just the MASH. There are other songs that should be graveyard smashes. We'd like to recommend to you a couple of songs that we think might catch on in a flash. Okay, I'm done with that joke now.
Okay, the Monster Mash is great and all, but it's just one song in a whole genre that deserves a second look. Here's some spooky tunes that are perfect for your Halloween playlist. We put one together. There's a link down in the description as well. We'll say more about that at the end.
Dinner with Drac Part 1 by John Zacherle.
When I learned that the main course was me.
Cool Ghoul John Zacherle was the obvious standout of all the Halloween novelty acts we've discovered, and our favorite tune of his is Dinner with Drac Part 1. It has this killer riff, and it's genuinely funny, and it has some pretty bangin' sax parts. It also has some truly ridiculous rhymes, and even expands its cast of characters past the usual suspects. Highly recommended. Also, if you like this one, he's got full albums of Halloween material, so there's way more to discover.
Mr. Werewolf by the Cactis. Mr. Werewolf only takes 7 seconds to weasel its way into your heart with its all-time great, silly intro. The band sings the title a few times before we get just the best cry for mercy in all of novelty music.
Please don't give me Mr. Werewolf!
Also, the song is just hilarious in terms of what the actual story is. They're pleading with a werewolf to let him pass like a werewolf is a bridge troll or something. Our singer has a hot date, and he just doesn't have any time for this werewolf nonsense. Big ups to this guy.
Vampira by Bobby Bear. Remember a few years ago when Resident Evil Village came out and everybody was losing their mind over the gigantic vampire lady? Well, that feeling is not a new one, because this song begins with the exact same sentiment. While Vampira wasn't actually 6'3", she was awesome and totally underappreciated during her lifetime, and I got her tattooed on my arm, so obviously I'm a huge fan. Also, this one swings and strays from the usual novelty song formula by just singing about having a good time with monsters, so we dig it.
Midnight Monsters Hot by Jack and Jim. Thematically, this song is much the same as the Monster Mash, but it's got a really good beat to it, and it's a lot more surfy and driving than some of the slower tunes on this list. A lot of these songs either stick to doo-wop or go all in on surf music, but this one splits the difference nicely.
Transylvania Twist by Baron Damon and the Vampires. Remember in Monster Mash when Dracula asks whatever happened to his Transylvania Twist? Well, here's a Transylvania Twist! I think that puts the song in the same universe as Monster Mash, so that's fun. Bobby Boris Pickett also has a tune with the same title, but this one's the superior song.
She's My Witch by Kip Tyler.
She's my witch.
I almost don't know if this song really even counts as a Halloween novelty song. It doesn't talk about a classic Halloween monster, witches. It's all about the speaker's lady friend and how cool and hot she is, and honestly, it might just be way thirstier than the other songs we're recommending. It's really good, though.
Screamin' Ball at Dracula Hall by the DuPonts.
Screaming ball, last night at Dracula Hall.
Is our final recommendation we'll make here. It's almost like an epilogue to all the other songs about having a party with monsters. It's from the perspective of a person looking back on how fun that party was from the vantage of the next day, and expands the mythos to have some more fun creatures like Dr. Cyclops and the Thing from Outer Space. Who are they? I want to party with those guys.
If you'd like a complete Halloween novelty song playlist, check out the link in the description. We put together a Spotify playlist so that you're totally welcome to look through it, steal from it, and claim you found all those songs yourself. We've organized it so that it gets weirder as it goes on, The fun, silly novelty stuff is at the top, and it gets more punky, obscure, and less explicitly Halloween the more you play. I'm absolutely certain we didn't talk about some songs that you could throw on this list, so please feel free to comment them below. And if you made it this far, thanks for subscribing. We hope you have a fun, safe, and happy Halloween this year. Stay spooky, folks.